Okay. Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver. Preface by Ishmael Reed. Though the young African American hip hop intellectuals picture Malcolm X as an apostle of armed resistance, their favorite poster is that of a rifle bearing Malcolm peering out from behind curtains, preparing to do battle with his enemies. The revolutions that both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. precipitated were textbook Sun Tzu. They produced change. King in the law, Malcolm in consciousness, without throwing a punch at whites or firing a shot. And though they are regarded as opposites, it was Malcolm's threats that were partially responsible for the establishment's agreeing to some of King's demands. Malcolm made wolfing and jive into an art form, and though his battles were fought on television, Marshall McLuhan referred to him as the electronic man, and his weapons were words, he was a symbol of black manhood. Our shining prince was the way Ozzie Davis put it in a eulogy delivered at Malcolm's funeral. Black men were in need of such a prince, manhood being very much on the minds of black men during the 60s. Their frustration was heightened when some black children were blown to bits during church services in Birmingham, Alabama. King Jr.'s macho critics thought that he had punked out when he used children in one of his nonviolent demonstrations. Black nationalist poet Askia Muhammad Touré wondered aloud, but who will protect the women's quarters? The desperate cry of men whose women were being poked with cattle prods and beaten to the ground by white thugs in uniform. I wrote a long, noisy, rambunctious poem entitled Fanfare for an Avenging Angel, dedicated to Malcolm, and after reading it, he told me, charitably, that it reminded him of works by Virgil and Dante. That's how we saw Malcolm X. He would make them pay for the humiliations we suffered in a racist country. Young black intellectuals were out for revenge. They were in a Kikuku warrior mode. On the West Coast, a young black prisoner was using the Spanish dungeon of the sort that used to hold slaves as his personal library. Eldridge Cleaver was also impressed with Malcolm X and took Malcolm X's position over that of Elijah Muhammad, whose generation called whites devils because they had come out of the southern racist hell where the whites had shown themselves to be capable of the most fiendish acts. As in the case of his hero, Malcolm X, Eldridge Cleaver went to school in jail, reading, writing, meditating, and practicing his intellectual style on mentors who were obviously no match for his probing, hungry intellect. In his book Soul on Ice, he confessed to a former career as a rapist and admitted to a relationship with white women, still the cardinal taboo in the eyes of white and black nationalists. He assured his readers, especially the Eastern left, which had the power to make celebrities of those who supported its issues, that he was a recovering racist, a former black Muslim who read and admired Norman Mailer's The White Negro, the usual bit of noble savage gibberish. But the recurrent theme in the book is that of an eternal struggle between the black supermasculine menial and the white omnipotent administrator, a struggle that continues in various forms to this day. While white males were on the receiving end of a criticism by black writers during the 60s and early 70s, Some white male writers and media commentators have since even gotten even by bonding with the black feminist movement and criticizing the treatment of black women by black men. In this war, women are regarded as bargaining chips and loot for both sides. The black ones, Amazons; the white ones, gullible Barbie dolls. A white guard objected to Cleaver having pictures of a white woman on his cell wall. This guard, like many white men, regarded all white women as their property, while black men feel that black women belong to them. Both groups were upset when the women declared that they own their own bodies, their souls, and their minds. In Soul on Ice, the women are either Madonnas or whores. In some gushy, heart wringing letters, Cleaver professed his love for his lawyer, Beverly Axelrod, and her responses, printed in the book, were equally cloying. Cleaver was first pushed as a celebrity by the New York Old Left and its branches in Northern California and Los Angeles. They had given up on the worker, at the time depicted by Robert Crumb and other underground cartoonists, as a bigoted, flag waving, Budweiser guzzling, hard hat, and incipient Reagan Democrat, and in his place substituted the black prisoner as proxy in their fight against capitalism. In the New York Times Magazine section, in an article that was preceded by a quote of mine that if Thomas Jefferson were around, he'd be reading Eldridge Cleaver, old lefter Harvey Swados referred to Cleaver as the quintessential American. And he is, in the sense that Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, Ellison's Reinhardt, Gerald Visnor's Bearheart, and the creatures in those African Native American animal tales who use guile, wit, and flattery to accomplish their ends are quintessential Americans. In a classic tale, a snake says to a benefactor who expresses dismay after being bitten by the creature it has rescued, "You knew I was a snake." I was in Leonard Bernstein's apartment the week before he gave a party for the Black Panthers, a party made notorious by Thomas Wolfe, in whose latest book, The Bonfire of the Vanities, blacks are likened to rats. And Bernstein, pointing to Cleaver's book on the coffee table, asked me, had I read him? I hadn't read him at the time, but figured that the New York left was going to make use of Cleaver and the Panthers, for whom he became Minister of Information. I said so publicly. I was hip to the Eastern intelligentsia, which was dabbling in Marxism at the time, and knew of the intelligentsia's contradictions. Leonard Bernstein, who was sympathetic to the Panthers' cause, was having trouble with black musicians like Arthur Davis, who accused the conductor of discriminating against black musicians. After the collapse of the Black Panther Party, Cleaver, like Doug Street in Wendell Harris's extraordinary film Chameleon Street, went through different changes. In Soul on Ice, he refers to himself as though he were different people. I was very familiar with the Eldridge who came to prison, but that Eldridge no longer exists, and the one I am now is a stranger to me. He went into exile and lived in Cuba, Algeria, and France, where it was rumored that he shared a mistress with a prime minister. Returned to become a fundamentalist minister, campaigned for the Republican senatorial nomination, designed clothes that highlighted the penis, and began a church devoted to the male reproductive organs and the preservation of sperm. Recently, he was criticized for poaching curbside recyclables on behalf of his church for the Great Taker that were intended for the nonprofit Berkeley Ecology Center. Once in a while, he appears in the local newspapers in trouble with the law over some petty charge or for assisting an elderly white woman from being evicted from her house. Sometimes the local media uses him for comic relief. He wrote a second book, Soul on Fire, which in many ways was as absorbing as Soul on Ice. But like Till Eulenspiegel, he had worked his tricks too many times. The book was ignored, and his description of his conversion to Christianity mocked. He said that he joined the fundamentalists because they had brought him from exile, and if the Panthers had brought him home, he would have sided with them. Each group of Cleaver's supporters claimed that it had been taken by the head of the Church of the Great Taker, but it could be argued that they did quite a bit of betraying themselves. Besides, if they had read Soul on Ice instead of marveling at the fact that a black prisoner could hold such a gifted mind, they would have learned that Cleaver's most persistent intellectual quality is doubt. And doubters aren't followers and are distrustful of structures, which is what perhaps inspired Amiri Baraka to describe Eldridge Cleaver as a bohemian anarchist, a highfalutin name for the trickster. His supporters used him, but he used them too. And who could blame a black man for using his wits to get out of one of these Nazi like pits, often guarded by depraved sadists, where the society had cast him to rot and die at the age of 22? Today, thousands of young black men like Cleaver languish in the country's prisons while the inside traitors receive light sentences for nearly wrecking the economic system, while the Justice Department spends millions of dollars to trap a black mayor on a misdemeanor charge, while the BCCI, money laundering enterprise, perhaps the biggest drug scandal in history, is ignored. And in a society where most of the SNLers won't even come to trial. Had Cleaver remained in prison without the publicity that ultimately led to his release, he'd probably be dead. By the end of the 60s, the left and the right, like lovers, began to trot toward each other so that at the beginning of the 80s, they were in bed together. Cleaver hurt James Baldwin. So did I, who was deemed politically incorrect by the young lions who were so paranoid about their manhood. Baldwin was also considered a sellout, and radical chic was the expression introduced by the late Seymour Krim to chastise Baldwin for permitting The Fire Next Time to be published in the New Yorker, the epitome of uptown pretensions and snobbery. Baldwin pretended that he didn't care. Baldwin used to tell me that he didn't mind my criticisms of him because, Ishmael, you're a writer, but that Cleaver and Baldwin underestimated each other. Far from being a clown, Cleaver is a writer too. And though Baldwin comes in for some vicious criticism from Cleaver, it is obvious that Soul on Ice is influenced by Baldwin's flamboyantly eloquent taxidermist style, just as Baldwin's If Bill Street Could Talk reminds one of Eldridge Cleaver. But Baldwin proved to be more reliable than Norman Mailer, who is championed in this book. Baldwin went to his grave protesting the injustices committed against the underdogs of the world by forces and institutions more powerful than them, while by the end of the 60s Norman Mailer was saying that he was tired of Negroes and their rights, and there is only a thin intellectual partition between his recent comments blaming blacks for the drug trade and those of the new policy elite at the New Republic, whose neoconservative about face can be gauged by the fact that an endorsement from the pre right wing New Republic appears on the paperback edition of Soul on Ice. The publisher Martin Peretz, who seems to spend all of his waking hours making up fibs about the underclass, formerly had ties with SDS, wouldn't you know? Cleaver supported the New York Review of Books, which during the 60s carried instructions on how to make a Molotov cocktail. Now prints long, unreadable pieces by Andrew Hacker denouncing affirmative action and seeking to divide Asian Americans from Black Americans with ignorant comments about the model minority. The New Left, who sought to use the Black Panthers to foment a violent revolution by the late 70s, had joined the Reagan consensus or had begun to wallow in a new selfish consumerism. Others became second thoughters, denouncing the Panthers before neoconservative banquets of the sort that get carried on C-SPAN. Sylvia Ann Hewlett describes the spirit of post-revolutionary America as that of a therapeutic mentality, which focuses on the self rather than a set of external obligations. Cleaver believed that the younger generation of whites would be wooed away from their omnipotent administrator fathers by African American dance and music. Whites began to dance better, but that didn't make them more humanistic. Rock and roll made billions for white artists and became the entertainment at white power rallies and accompanied the black hating lyrics of Axl Rose. Even the creator of the Willie Horton campaign, Lee Atwater, received a better review in the New York Times for his rock and roll music than Miles Davis. Rolling Stone, which was the voice of the counterculture during the 60s, went Republican and upscale, and Malcolm X, the symbol of black 60s manhood, had been outed in a new book by Bruce Perry. The groups that are the subjects of so much abuse in Soul on Ice, women and gays, the Cleaver of Soul on Ice considers homosexuality to be a disease, have placed their oppression front and center and have even made villains of the former black male machos who fantasize a revolution while borrowing their strategies. These groups could even be accused of trivializing the oppression of the white and black underclass because once you propose that all women, including Queen Elizabeth, or all gays, including Malcolm Forbes, are oppressed, then everybody is oppressed, even the omnipotent administrator, white males with PhDs, the new oppressed, whom the media would have us believe are being set upon by a politically correct multiculturalism. And now Hollywood, which poured money into Black Panther coffers, will get its money back with interest, with a slew of films now in the works about the Black Panthers, demonstrating that Cleaver's scientific socialism was no match for the witchcraft of capitalism. One of these films is being scripted by Anna Hamilton Phelan, the writer of Gorillas in the Mist, the favorite film of the Gestapo wing of the LAPD. Capitalism could even transform a group that once advocated its overthrow into box office receipts and t-shirt revenue. Whatever became of Jerry Rubin and Cleaver's wife Kathleen Cleaver? They went to Wall Street. Tom Hayden married Jane Fonda. I always wondered what would have happened if Cleaver and Huey Newton and the Panthers hadn't been used as pawns in a struggle between the white right, who destroyed them, and the white left, who piled an agenda on them that went way beyond their original community concerns and who viewed them as cannon fodder. They wanted a nigger to pull the trigger, as one Panther put it. Thanks to the Panthers, the downtown Oakland political establishment is black, but that doesn't seem to prohibit the police from continuing to beat the shit out of black people in Oakland. And as elsewhere in the case of these black ceremonial governments, the cash is controlled by whites. They also elected a congressman. Huey Newton was shot dead in the gutter and was bitterly denounced before his body was even cold by a post New Left Berkeley alternative newspaper whose editorial line mirrors the confusion of the left. One week printing a long piece sympathetic to still imprisoned Panther Geronimo Pratt, another week printing an article favorable to University of California anthropologist Vincent Sarvik, a member of the New Oppressed, who maintains that women and blacks are intellectually deficient because of their small brain size. The same argument that Hitler's scientists used to advance against the professor's ancestors. In this political and cultural environment, Cleaver seems a has been, and the villain in his book, Lyndon Johnson, promoter of the Great Society, and Barry Goldwater, who challenged the CIA's mining of the Nicaraguan harbor, in comparison to the sinister crowd in power now, seem like populists from the quaint old days of the American Weimar. But I suspect that history is not finished with Eldridge Cleaver. If he never does another thing in his life, he wrote this book. It's not just a book about the 60s like those books and films written by his former white allies that prove that the authors were white nationalists all along because they omit or give scant attention to the role of blacks who created the political and cultural matrix for that decade. The conclusion of one recent film, Mark Kitchell's Berkeley in the 60s, most of whose narrators are white women, seems to be that of the significance of the political and cultural upheaval of the 60s was that it led to the formation of the middle class feminist movement. The reissue of Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice will challenge the current bleaching out of the black influence on the cultural and political climate of the 60s. This book is a classic because it is not merely a book about that decade, regarded as demonic by some and by others as the most thrilling and humanistic of this century. Soul on Ice is the 60s. The smell of protest, anger, tear gas, and the sound of skull crackling billy clubs, helicopters, and revolution is present in its pages. The old cover's image of the lilies juxtaposed with the young prisoner's rugged face and unkempt hair is apt. Out of the manure that American society can often be for black men, the growth and beauty of their genius cannot be repressed, cannot be denied.
October 9th. That's where it starts.
You see, it's the same old thing.